This is the Journal of Trauma Nursing Behind the Research podcast with your moderator, Kristen Kryman, broadcasting from the Penn Presbyterian Medical Center located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This program is brought to you by Walters Clore in collaboration with the Society of Trauma Nurses, ensuring optimal care through education, collaboration, leadership, and research. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Our guests today are the authors of the article Exposing Compassion Fatigue and Burnout Syndrome in a Trauma Team, which was published in the January-February 2016 edition of the Journal of Trauma Nursing. Gina Berg is the Research Associate Professor from the University of Kansas School of Medicine. Hi, Gina. Can you introduce yourself and your team for the audience today?
I'd love to. Thank you very much. So my name is Gina Berg, and I'm the Research Director for the Trauma Program at Wesley Medical Center in Wichita, Kansas. And I'm also a Research Associate Professor at the University of Kansas School of Medicine in Wichita, Kansas. And I'm a human factors psychologist. And I have with me today Diana Lipple, she's now retired, so she's a very seasoned and expert trauma nurse, and I love collaborating with her. I just want to say thank you for having us. We're excited to be here, and I also would like to tell you how excited we are that we were the recipient of the 2016 Literary Excellence Award, and all the interest that the trauma nurse readership of the journal showed in our article was very exciting. And I'd also just like to give a little shout out to my trauma team who shared their vulnerable experiences for this study.
So Gina, can you explain to us a little bit about compassion fatigue?
Sure. Compassion fatigue was really described in the literature the first time by a psychologist named Figley, and he describes that as those suffering from compassion fatigue present as emotionally exhausted. They report sadness, depression, sleeplessness, and general anxiety, and they often feel as if they've failed at their profession, and they don't feel like they still have the capacity to nurture their patients. The symptoms for compassion fatigue include cognitive re-experiencing, for example, nightmares or intrusive thoughts, avoidance behaviors, increased arousal, depression, even suicide ideation, anxiety, irritability, lack of confidence, and decreased functioning in both their professional and their non-professional lives. That kind of leads to burnout syndrome, which is defined as long-term exhaustion and diminished interest, and those symptoms include also fatigue, headaches, that can be eating disorders, insomnia, emotional instability, and then really going overboard in rigidity in their interpersonal relationships.
So, Gina, how did you and Diana become interested in this topic for your research?
Well, I first became interested because I am not clinically trained, and I do research with my clinical partners, and I had been working with them for several years. And one day we had a meeting to talk about a different research project, and I came over and I really experienced a different sense of my clinical partners, and they really couldn't engage with me. We didn't have the same rapport that we normally have. And so I started asking questions about what had happened and what was going on. And what I learned was that I walked in immediately after a failed resuscitation of a 2-year-old that suffered from child abuse and did not survive. And so I started asking some additional questions about how do they cope with situations like that? What's the institutional response to that? What's their personal response to that? And Diana and I started having a conversation about it, and we decided that we would operationalize that into a research project. Diana, what was your interest in this topic?
Well, as a leader, I think you're always, you're always worried about the morale of your staff, whether it's the morale, the whether or not they are on task, on point, whether they can focus, and can they be attentive to the detail. And this is especially true in both the areas that I covered, and that was critical care and trauma. Without a team that can focus, without a team that has high morale, the medical mistakes are very high. So therefore, I felt it was important, not only from a perspective of the staff itself, to make sure that they are well and do things well, not just for the institution but for themselves. So I started looking at compassion fatigue. I looked at, I'm an old nurse, so therefore I call it burnout, and how fast can burnout occur, and what does it do to your team. That part was what interested me in getting that down, along with just the financial impact of what turnover does to an organization.
So Diana, being in your director or manager role, what do you consider to be the most impactful takeaways from your research on compassion fatigue?
Well, as I read, I read and I've reread this article, as obviously, but a year later or so, I read it again, and I think as a leader, there are several takeaways that you can take from it. One is it's important to have some type of strategy, some type of thought process that surrounds what's about my team. Is my team going through compassion fatigue? What happens when there is a child that comes in that is failed resuscitation? What is the demeanor of the day? So therefore, if you don't take that in consideration, if you just go on day after day after day, the compassion fatigue and the burnout symptoms just increase and increase. So my impact from this is just to know that there are ways to cope with it. There's ways to avoid it. There's ways to deal with it. There's ways, and those ways are important to incorporate in your daily activities as a leader. To really have a finger on the pulse of your staff and what's going on with them, because you get a physician or a key nurse that gets into a burnout situation. I think one of the things that we found out and we've read about is that it is contagious. And so you really want to make certain that you incorporate some type of strategies within your work environment to deal with burnout.
So once this epidemic, if you would, starts and the nurses start to become burnt out, what do you suggest that a nurse would do to implement strategies to help them through the burnout in their own practices?
I think as a practitioner, you have got to be able to have an understanding that burnout can occur, that compassion fatigue can occur. You can't walk into being a member of a trauma team and decide that, you're strong and I'm great, I'm good, and I'm focused, and I know all the things there is about trauma. You have got to go in there with the idea that it can have an effect on you. And that effect on you is important to keep in mind, to keep in your forefront. If you don't do that, it'll sneak up on you. So it used to be, we'd say, you got 5 years of any nursing experience and you need to change nursing, where you're working, because you can't deal with it. And especially in trauma, it actually reduced to something like 2.5 to 3 years. Well, that's a shame when you're taking into consideration that you've got a lot of education and a lot of expertise that are sitting there in that nurse, and all of a sudden she can't function. So it's important as a practitioner that you understand that trauma can have a very big impact on you, and special ones. So first of all, identifying your triggers. What are your stress triggers? They're not all the same. And I think that's an important thing to think about, whether those are, the child's death, or if it's, for some of them, it was just the smell of blood. What is a massive amount of blood has a distinct odor. And so therefore if that's a trigger, then you need to be aware of it and be able to talk about it and be able to understand it. That's as a practitioner. It's just being aware that it can happen and getting ahead of it. As a leader, basically the same thing. Understand your team. Knowing that team well enough to be able to ward off some of those things. Not as, watch your roster every day. What kind of traumas came in? What did they have to do? Because in the middle of the night, an elder abuse might trigger some people, and you need to be aware of that, to understand what triggers your physicians, because they have the same kind of these feelings too, and they try to tell you they are, but they're not. And I think that's the important thing. We used to think that you had to be tough and you couldn't cry, and you just couldn't let people think that you were stressed out by something, and I think that's the wrong approach to take.
So thank you for sharing that. If a staff member did feel that compassion fatigue or burnout, or did experience those triggers, I would imagine that you would suggest that maybe they would try to communicate that either to someone from their team, maybe a colleague, maybe their manager. Are there support systems within the hospital that they might be able to access? As a manager, is there something maybe they could be referred to if they experience those symptoms?
Most hospitals have some type of support system for that. If the practitioner will take advantage of it, that is the real key. Whether that's a chaplain service that is specifically identified to be able to deal with some of those things. Our chaplain services are specific to trauma, so therefore they realize not only what is going on with the family and the patient, but what happened is a lot of it has to deal with the team. So there's the chaplaincy services, and not always is it about the religious aspect, it's about the individual. The second one, we generally have some type of psychology support within the hospital that can be utilized. But the main one is that they have a realization that they are not alone in this, that this happens to everyone. And it may be a different trigger, but they need to be able to talk amongst themselves, to be able to discuss it. We used to have, post-trauma, and I think they probably still do, but there's downtimes post-trauma that you can say, wow, that was a bad trauma. That really was a bummer. I didn't like that one. And be able to voice that to their colleagues. Peer counseling is absolutely essential. And I think that most of our trauma team understands that they do counsel one another.
That's excellent.
The findings that we found in our paper is that none of the respondents had any training and coping skills, and they reported that there were institutional options, but they were very uncomfortable about using and hesitant to use. So they reported that there's basically two types of coping. That there's group coping, like Diana talked about. They talk amongst themselves. They do spontaneous debriefings, and I observed that. They would do that in dyads or triads. That's what I walked in on when I first observed the phenomena. And then there's individual strategies that were reported in our research were withdrawal. They would go out and be by themselves. They especially were worried about people thinking that they were weird if they had an emotional response, so they would withdraw to be by themselves. And then one of them talked about that he just had to go be alone and get on the treadmill, so exercising was a way that he could work through some of the stress. Overall, I think it's a program that, like Diana talked about, has to be openly acknowledged that this exists, compassion fatigue exists, and burnout exists, so that the stigma can be reduced. Some strategies that a leader could do is, first of all, I'd go to the literature and look for evidence-based strategies to reduce compassion fatigue, but in our article we recommended we use two assessments, the professional quality of life assessment and the whole Holmes-Ray life stress inventory. Those are free inventories that people can get and use to self-test so that they're self-aware of the symptoms that they're having. If a leader did that, maybe on an annual basis, they would kind of get the pulse of what the team overall coping skills are, and then be able to address that with some education and intervention. For the leader, I think in leadership training, they should probably get some specific training in how they do social support for their team, because that's kind of a skill that should be developed in the leader of the program. I would also say that coping, instead of just addressing it post an event that didn't go well or that had a negative outcome, that maybe it get discussed on a regular basis, maybe in every staff meeting. Obviously, like Diana said, you have to respond to high trigger events, and the focus group team identified any kind of abuse, mostly events or resuscitations with children, dealing with family members. When the team broke down or when the process broke down, they described those as stress triggers identified in this situation, and those were consistent with the literature. So, and then also I think one of the things that might not be done well is that they don't emphasize positive outcomes well. They don't celebrate successes well. And in those spontaneous debriefings of maybe a negative event, if this was some anecdotal conversations that we had, that when the trauma surgeon said we did everything we could, this death was not preventable, then the team could walk away and they weren't self-doubting as much. They had confidence that they did come to the table and do the right thing and contribute to the resuscitation event appropriately. And then another strategy that a leader could take is consider, especially in high-stress events as trauma teams, consider doing some pre-employment screening for resiliency, because really it's a person that needs to have high personal resiliency probably in those roles.
Your findings, what do you suggest for further research for this topic?
I was very surprised to find that in our 12 focus group members, that a fourth of them were experiencing low compassion and high burnout. And so that means at any one time, at any resuscitation event, probably in the way our trauma program model is set up, at least one person is experiencing that at every trauma resuscitation. So that is, unfortunately, leads to an opportunity to a team breakdown, maybe a patient safety issue. So I think further research going into that, knowing that it's such a prevalent issue, is probably program development for coping mechanisms, developing resiliency in the team, both individual resiliency and team resiliency. There are strategies out there for that. And then once you implement some of those programs, you obviously need to do some evaluation for effectiveness of the program. So I think that's probably the most important direction. The literature tells us, it's pretty evident in the literature, that compassion fatigue and burnout and secondary traumatic stress in secondary providers, not necessarily first responders. It's very prevalent in first responder literature, but now we're starting to see it in secondary responders. So once the patient's brought inside the hospital, the trauma team that's caring for that patient inside the hospital, that those people are also experiencing stress. So I think we don't need to find that it exists anymore. We know that it exists. It's how we start addressing it and reducing it and managing it and then ultimately preventing it. Financial impact, that's where
I like to see some things on financial impact. With healthcare costs as they are today and the emphasis on healthcare costs, I believe that everything that we do in research ought to have some type of connection with a little bit of the financial. And for administration to have an understanding that putting a little money into something may actually cost you less than what this particular subject cost you in the beginning. So can you have, it's a little bit of preventive medicine, I suppose, is what I want to say. But financially, what is the impact? How can we deal with that? And how does it have it on the overall healthcare costs in the United States? I think the more we put out there in literature, even if it's articles on compassion, fatigue, burnout, all of that, the more you put out there, it becomes more of an accepted, it's there, it's not going to go away, it's a part of the system. And as a trauma nurse, a trauma physician, a trauma respiratory therapist, whatever you are doing in trauma, you have got to have some expectation, some way to deal with that, and not just expect that I can just go through life and go, I'm tough, I'm okay, because it doesn't work that way. So more articles, similar to this one, repeated articles just like this one. What is it that brings it out into the open?
The journal published a fabulous psychometric article about compassion fatigue a while back, but I'm not sure at the operational level that everybody can distill that down to what does that mean in my team. And the hope for this article was that people would see, wow, I see this in my team, and somebody is reporting in the literature that this is happening in their team, and we're having the conversation about it, and they're giving us some ideas and help on how to address this. And then I, as the team leader, who hopefully is reading this article, don't feel so alone. And what do I do about this? It must just be us. I see these same things in my team members, and so I can see that that's in the literature. So now I can start developing some strategies, or start talking to people about how do we respond to this as a team leader. So we're very excited that you guys shared our research in the journal.
I think this is such a relevant topic, and a lot of nurses really do feel that, and they're looking for help, or they feel that there's just something that they can't discuss with others, or they have to hide. And I think the more that this comes out in the literature and in the forefront and is more recognizable, that it will really help the practitioners deal with things and be more resilient in the future. Gina and Diana, I want to say thank you so much for sharing your work with us today and for being with us. We really look forward to reading more articles from you in the future, and we enjoyed your company today. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Our pleasure.
This was a Behind the Research podcast brought to you by the Journal of Trauma Nursing, the official journal of the Society of Trauma Nurses. For more information about the author or about JTN, visit us on the web at journals.lww.com/Journal of Trauma Nursing, on Facebook at Journal Trauma Nursing, or on Twitter at JTN_online.